Okay, hi, Dr. Wood. My name is Teresa Mason, and here is my oral midterm. Okay, so for chapter 1, you asked the question of how have recent historical events affected the course of research in organizational psychology? Give an example of an event and the resulting outcome. Okay, well, looking at our text, Jux and Britt tell us that the past 10 years we've seen a few different historical events that have influenced organizational psychology. So sort of these kind of broad range events, like the baby boomers retiring. For instance, about 31% of the federal workforce was eligible to retire in 2017. They didn't all retire, which is great. But we have basically 45% of our federal employees that are 50 years or older. So that could be a problem. Then, of course, the advances in technology have made things quite different in how we communicate, and that's pluses and minuses. The 24-hour news cycle, electronic media outlets, and all these kinds of things have made big changes. And, of course, a focus on global economy, global economics. And I love the one where it says about the impact of the recession of 2008. I cannot wait to see what happens now that we have the record low unemployment, which is awesome. Okay, and so the other one was this emergency preparedness. Now, I initially wanted to focus on that because after 9/11, I know things really changed quite a bit. And a lot of organizations were focusing on emergency preparedness. So, what I came up with is, instead of emergency preparedness, there was this idea of how industrial organizational psychology can impact and possibly reduce terrorist attacks, to thwart them, to thwart the organizations. And I thought that was kind of interesting. So I stumbled upon an article in TIP, the organizational psychologist, from 2011. And this was by Lily Cushenberry, and Jeffrey Lovelace. And they looked at, they're from Penn State's International Center for the Study of Terrorism. They received a grant from the Office of Naval Research to study improvised explosive devices, and in order to increase understanding of how IEDs could be used in operational theater. They did this study, and the study they actually did was of the Provisional Irish Republican Army, and they looked at lots of data here to find out all they could about these organizations. And what they've been able to find out is they've also been, besides the IEDs, they also been to find out about how terrorist organizations promote, maintain, develop, and protect key personnel with critical skills and knowledge of explosives. And I'm sure of everything else in the organizations as well. So there's some other areas that I believe IO could be used, and how organizations like Al-Qaeda, what happened when Osama bin Laden was killed? How did they restructure that leadership? What happened to the organization? And then looking at things like, how do these terrorist organizations select, train, motivate their followers? So there's actually an awful lot that we can learn from the terrorists, lots that we can, as industrial organizational psychologists, learn that could help key military, U.S. military and our allies, figure out how to sabotage these. I mean, one of the things that I keep thinking about is, this kind of blend of social psychology, is this idea that how do these people use the internet? They use technology against us. I mean, they rave about, oh, we shouldn't have this, and it's blasphemous, and it, you're an infidel because you have all this technology, basically. But then they use it against us, and that's fascinating. So I think industrial organizational psychology could really help us answer that question. Okay, I'm going to reset my timer and move on to number 2. Hang on one second. Okay. Let's start it again. Okay, so for the second question, describe the socialization process for graduate students in your program. Is the program successful in socializing newcomers and creating job embeddedness? Well, it's not really job embeddedness, but it definitely is in the sense that being in grad school is like a job. I mean, let's just, I know today has been crazy. Me trying to balance Father's Day and trying to figure out how to record a video without my phone. I'm just kind of lost. So it really is a job. So this program at Liberty, I'm doing the master's in interdisciplinary studies, and I'm combining industrial organizational psychology and crisis counseling. The socialization process is more at the university level. Okay, so when I first was interested and I contacted Liberty, it was this idea of, apply, and I applied, and then it was follow up and phone calls and emails, walking me through all the process steps of how to become the student, how to enroll, register for my classes, to get the financial aid, and all of those other things that I needed to do to sort of get myself started in the process. These kind of basic services that all students need when they first start. So it really, I don't think there's been much socialization other than that. Now, I think the socialization process actually is going to happen more on the course level and from the individual instructors. So like this term, I'm taking the interdisciplinary 500, which is required for your first semester, and learning an awful lot about interdisciplinary study. I mean, here I just thought I was just getting a master's degree with 2 different areas of focus, but little did I know that there's actually this real different piece in there, which is very fascinating. And so I think that I'm going to use an example from another part of my life. So years and years ago, I got another graduate degree. And this was more of a traditional, not online, standard graduate program. And so the socialization was a lot more formal and more involved. It was an all-day kind of orientation. I remember going to it. It was in early August, and it was hot, and wasn't really pleased about being there. But anyway, but it was good, because what they did was they sort of did this, they did it by cohort. So they did it by all the people coming in that year for that degree all together, which was great, because then we got to meet everyone. And so that kind of the anticipatory socialization already began, really, once we met them. And then it just went on from there. And then they would take us from place to place and talk to us about the different things that would happen. For instance, policies and procedures. There was a lot of stuff that you weren't supposed to do that was official. And then, of course, you find out from the present grad students that you can bend this rule, but you can't bend that rule. So all that kind of informal socialization was really interesting to me. And I found that actually much more compelling. What the current graduate students were telling us about what it's like to be a grad student in that program. I actually learned more, and I was socialized better by that than I think by anything formal that they put together for us. Learning things like basically how to deal with some of the coursework. I mean, everybody was afraid of the regression class, and it was like, oh, it's like a rite of passage, you're taking this regression class. And so, I worried about it for years. I actually did pretty well when I finally did take it, but, it's one of those things. It's sort of like this grad school lore and myth and, and all this stuff. So, but learning things like how to deal with different people, how to get your schedule, how to deal with your assistantship, things that you have to do now so that you can do 3 or 4 steps later. Things like the best place to study if you're alone, if you're in a group, where to get the best coffee, which part of the library's got the best bathroom. I mean, all kinds of sort of these intangible, not formal sort of things that I learned that was really great. So I believe that process served me well, and the connections that I made going through it with a cohort was really special. And it's kind of difficult to do on an online, because I have no idea who my fellow cohort is. I can't see them. I don't even see a picture. I don't hear their voice. And for me, a lot of communication is that. I have felt very connected with my professors, which is really good. But I really would have preferred to have a little bit more contact. But it's what I chose, this online program. Okay, time to move on. Timer says it's time to move on. So we are moving on. I better go a little faster, because I have a lot more to say about some of these other things. Okay, so the next one. how can an organization reduce or prevent work-family conflict? Let's see. Well, I think like with any problem, it's much better to prevent it than it is to repair it. So let's start with that. Now, this has been a topic for the past, half century. We've all had to work. We've all have to juggle stuff. And Kahn and colleagues in 1964 conceptualized it as role conflict, where one role overloads the other, and so we're affected, the individual with the family and the job, and all those roles sort of overwhelm each other. So 50 years later, we're still looking at this, and some say it's nearly impossible to avoid with our 24/7, like the technology things I mentioned earlier, with our 24/7 news cycle, with us being available 24/7. Why haven't you responded to my email? And now it's not just email, it's texting. Why haven't you responded to my text? It's sort of everyone wants this immediate gratification and response. So it's really kind of hard to make it to say, oh, I just turned my phone off. They're like, what? You turned your phone off? That just doesn't happen. Anyway, so one of the things that we looked at is when companies institute benefits and policies that help the family, they're called work-family policies. And these are things like flexible work schedule, telework opportunities, on-site daycare facilities, whether there's a gym there, whether they provide you with money to go to a different gym, or there's yoga, or any of those things that might bring more of a balance of quality and reduce stress to your life. And so those have been very successful in reducing work-family conflict. The problem I found when I was doing my investigation and when I was writing my module for last week was that these family-friendly policies will attract talented people to your company. No doubt about it. The problem comes, though, is if there's a culture where you feel like you're not able to use any of these tools, when you feel like if you do leave early to go to your kid's soccer game, that it's actually going to look bad on you and you're going to be passive of promotion, or there's going to be some kind of bias against you for actually using those tools that they've put into place. So a lot of this comes down to the culture of the organization where you can actually use them, and it could be sort of segmented into different departments. So we need to make sure that it's a culture where you can use it. Now, one of the things I also wrote about was this idea of supervisors. So leadership and supervision is a critical piece in reducing work-family conflict. So supervisor support can buffer the effects of work-family conflict on employee strain. And if we look at these family supportive supervisor behaviors, including the supervisor's acknowledgement that something is going on, that, oh, I know your mother's been sick, or I know your daughter's been sick, can we do anything? Do you need a day off? Do you want to work from home? I mean, those kinds of sort of things where the supervisor feels kind of empowered by the organization to make these, judgment calls. Some days you need assistance, some days you don't. And it would be great. Now, anytime your supervisor supports you, it leads to less conflict and stress in general. And it leads to better well-being, which I think is definitely a goal that we should all shoot for. And I can't believe I finished that one so quickly when I thought that was going to be one of the ones I went over. Let's move on. I started talking faster, so maybe I should slow down a little bit. Okay. Question 4. Imagine you have been asked to develop a performance assessment program for employee development. What technique could you use to adequately evaluate employee performance as comprehensively as possible? Think of the Murphy list. Okay, so job performance is defined very broadly in our book as all the behaviors employees engage in while at work. Well, this is a fairly imprecise definition because it really is all the behaviors. Campbell in 1990 came up with a more specific definition, saying behaviors employees engage in while at work that contribute to organizational goals. This is more specific, and there are two models basically of job performance that were proposed, one by Campbell and one by Murphy. So both of the models look at two overarching dimensions, the in-role task performance or the extra-role or contextual performance. And the in-role are specific tasks that are required for you to do your job. And the extra role are things like non-technical or just sort of these intangible things like effective soft skills, they call it. I'm sorry, soft skills. Very effective communication skills, that you have motivation, you have enthusiasm, that you're a good team player, but you also take initiative. So all of these things that employers really like, but they're really hard to measure. And so when we first considered this model, the assessment piece came out in '89, which, there's basically, what is it, eight different ways of assessment. And then the larger kind of model of job performance was in 1994, based on the U.S. Navy, though you could use it for civilians. So in the assessment piece from Murphy, you can use paper and pencil tests, job skills tests, on-site hands-on training, off-site hands-on training, high-fidelity simulations, symbolic simulations, task ratings, and global ratings. So the most commonly used among these are basically your tasks, specific tasks for your job, and kind of overall global ratings of your performance. So the 7th and 8th one that I just kind of talked about. So when you're looking at dividing these things up, so the inner role, the task-oriented behaviors, those are like, if you were a professor, let's use that example since we were doing it, did you report your grades on time? Did you produce your syllabus? Did you go to class when you were supposed to? Things like that are specific tasks that you're supposed to do in your job. And then the extra role are things like interpersonally oriented behaviors, so the communication skills, the team player, and all that sort of stuff, building relationships, that kind of thing. And then downtime behaviors, which is the behaviors that you do outside of work. Unfortunately, some people turn to drugs and alcohol a lot, and that can really affect their work. And it could also be extra jobs. If you aren't making that much in your current position and you have a new need that comes up. I know one year we had needed HVAC, and I was like, where are we going to get this extra money? Well, you might take a side job, and that could affect your primary job. And then there are always destructive hazardous behaviors, safety violations, sabotage, accidents. So it's kind of it's easier basically to do the specific task related behaviors. So for university professor, as I mentioned, the recording of grades and syllabus and all that stuff, but more global ratings, I would think, would be this sort of student and peer reviewed, because students can tell you how engaged you are with the classroom, how motivated and excited you are about the subject matter, how well you know the subject matter, how fair you are in assessing their work and giving out their grades, and if you have a compelling course. And peer reviewers can also come and observe your teacher and rate those exact same things, which I actually think would be a good idea if they both rated the same things. I see a lot of times where they rate totally different things. All right, 35 seconds. So I won't have time to really talk about what you can do with the research is also easier, because with research, it's more of a task specific for a professor. So you either went to a conference and presented or you didn't. You published or you didn't, and those kinds of things. And this list, Murphy's list, won't translate to every job, obviously. Like, I think high fidelity simulations are for astronauts and pilots, and I can't think of any other reason, but not for university professors. But we have to move on because we are out of time. Is this the final question? Yes! I can't believe it's the final question. Okay. Here we go. What are some possible common organizational constraints? How could they lead to counterproductive behaviors? Well, first, let's define this. Organizational constraint are conditions at work that inhibit, interfere with, or fail to support an individual's performance of job tasks. And that's from Peters and O'Connor in 1980. Then we have organizational constraints are situational inhibitors of performance. And that's Klein and Kim in 98 and Villanova and Roman in 93. So these are significant OCs or significant job stressors that can be linked to employee strain. So there's kind of a theory underlying this, and that is the stressor strain framework, which is based on the transactional stress theory. And so basically, if these environmental stress are perceived and evaluated by the employees being a threat to their well-being, it leads to strain. And if there's an imbalance between the amount of strain and the demands on them and their ability to cope, then we have issues. And the evaluation of the environmental stressor as a threat depends a lot on that individual, because there's individual differences and one's ability to cope and tolerate stress, and also what's going on in the rest of their lives. If things are going swimmingly at home, maybe they can tolerate more stress at work. But if they're having a stressor at home, they might not be able to tolerate it at work. And so overarching, we have like monetary constraints, we have kind of intellectual capital constraints, we have technology constraints, cultural, legal, regulatory, or political constraints. So some of the sources, those are sort of the overarching, but some of the sources of stressors. Poor environmental conditions, which I think is pretty prevalent. If you look at the sort of videos that were put on by Oklahoma teachers in terms of what their schools look like and their supplies look like, bingo. So inferior equipment and supplies that make the work more difficult to do, more time consuming, anything that wastes their time stresses the employee. Anytime you have unnecessary rules or regulations for how you do stuff, or you have, like I was mentioning, kind of technology that doesn't work. I had a job where technology never worked, and I spent so much time and effort trying to navigate their system. I couldn't even get all my work done, and that was very frustrating. Heavy workloads, of course, if there are heavy workloads, you're much more likely to have your OCs are more salient. And pay restrictions, obviously. Lots of people don't get paid what they think they're worth. And especially if you don't believe you're getting paid compared to someone in your industry somewhere else, then you're going to have a lot of problems with feeling strain. And then we get to counterproductive work behaviors, CWBs. And this is a general term that we use for any employee behavior that runs counter to organizational goals, or in some ways, as Spector and Fox 2005 said, volitional or conscious acts that harm or are intended to harm organizations or people in those organizations. And if you look at, Spector has a 5-factor model. He came up with production deviance, where you basically work slowly, or you do stuff incorrectly, or you don't follow the instructions, or sabotage, in which you deliberately try to undermine work done in the organization, or purposely you damage equipment or waste materials and that sort of thing. The third is theft, where you take property, and it could be as minor as office supplies or as major as merchandise or pieces of equipment. Withdrawal basically is very broad, but it's basically disengaging from your work. And this is going missing under some false pretense, being late or absent, taking longer lunches or breaks than allowed. And then the final one is abuse towards others, which should never happen, but unfortunately it does. This could be verbal or physical behaviors, spreading negative rumors about someone at work, making fun of someone's personal life, threatening someone with bodily harm, verbally attacking someone. Now these things could be actionable and should never happen, but unfortunately they do. So if we go back to our stressor strain framework based on transactional stress theory, when an individual is unable to cope with the strain, they may act out towards the company or an individual in that company. For instance, theft is much more likely to occur, and I'm about to lose my timer, but we're going to go ahead and finish it up. Sorry. Theft is likely to occur when an employee believes he's being paid less, that pay restriction. Environmental constraints, and there's poor equipment, could also lead to, besides theft, production, reduced production. And sabotage is likely to happen when an employee perceives injustice. Some kind of injustice has occurred, and they're going to sabotage things. So thank you very much. I hope I fulfilled the requirements of the examination for you. Thank you.